Hello interwebs, I hope you are all doing well, and for today's video, before we get into the meat of what we're going to be discussing here, I want to give a big content warning that we are going to be discussing quite directly sexual assault and a word that I cannot say without YouTube probably demonetizing and age restricting this video, but it rhymes with grape. And again, I'm really frustrated that I can't actually use the word, but dealing with what we are dealing with here, but we are going to be discussing those topics quite directly because I want to talk about the recent discourse, let's just say, around the fact that the show Star Wars Andor featured a scene where a character, Bix, has an Imperial officer attempt to sexually assault and, as the show directly names, rape her. It is the first time, at least to my awareness and knowledge, that the word is used within Star Wars. And the scene itself, and I'll give context for it in just a minute, but the scene itself was rather visceral in its depiction of what was happening and what the intention was by the Imperial officer who is coming after Bix. It is a really rough scene to watch. And it is the darkest that Star Wars has ever gotten in discussions of this. And as a result of this scene, there has been an overriding discourse around whether or not Star Wars should depict something like this within it. And there have been some good faith, and let's just say, I don't even necessarily want to say bad faith, because the arguments are not coming from they're coming from an earnest place, I believe, from certain folks. But I think childish, I think would be maybe even the best words, discussion around it. And I say childish very specifically, and I'll get into why in just a moment. I don't even necessarily mean that in insulting terms, generally speaking. For some I do. But generally speaking, I don't even mean childish in an insulting way. Because I think discussing Star Wars as a franchise for children is actually a worthwhile discussion point here. And I also should be very clear that I myself have complicated feelings about this that I'll discuss as we get into this. But let me give a little bit of background on this before I get into the overriding discourse. As I mentioned, the show featured a scene where a character of Bix Kalen, who is one of the lead female characters on the show, is a migrant on an agricultural planet, an illegal migrant on an agricultural planet, where she is hiding out from the Empire. She is there as an illegal, she doesn't have visas, she doesn't have passports, and so the Imperial Empire comes to the planet, and they are just doing standard checkups. They are basically checking in on their quota of the wheat and crop that they are essentially harvesting from this community. And one of the things that the show depicts is that there are many illegal immigrants and migrants on this agricultural colony who are working the farms because the people there need the work, and so do the migrants need the work. And there are many in the imperial system who remain willfully ignorant of this situation because they know it feeds everybody. And this is quite clearly meant to reflect what happens in many different places, but I think most directly, or maybe I'm biased, but I think it's most directly meant to reflect what happens in the United States. There are many farms and agricultural places in the United States who hire illegal migrants because they can pay them less, and the migrants need the work. This has been an ongoing dynamic for decades, and it has become an even bigger topic. I mean, immigration is always a big topic, but obviously Donald Trump has been actively vilifying immigrants and attacking immigrants and sending people to secret El Salvadorian prisons, which is absolutely fucking terrifying. But even more interestingly, the show is not necessarily reflecting the overt vilification of migrants here. It's reflecting how the system enables it, but also will be willing to wield it where it can to have power. And so in this episode, we see an Imperial officer who basically goes on a power trip, who knows for a fact that Bix is an illegal migrant and is willing to try to coerce sex out of her for his own benefit so that he will look the other way in exchange as the quid pro quo. He'll let her stay. He won't call her visa. He won't arrest her if she has sex with him, which is It is coercing sex out of someone who cannot consent, given the power dynamic. And then when she turns him down, directly tries to assault her. And eventually she kills him. They have a really harrowing struggle in which she does end up, thankfully, killing the bastard. And all of this in this episode is a true reflection of how people who have these positions of power will use it, especially men in a patriarchal society that devalues women and wants to use women, will use their power to try to coerce sex out of women in vulnerable positions like this. It is a very true thing that does actually happen. It's gross and disgusting, but it is a true thing. And as a result of this scene, there was a discourse created around whether or not, as I said, Star Wars should depict this. And it has mainly galvanized around a tweet created by YouTuber Star Wars Theory, who I have many, many thoughts on, none very positive. But in his tweet, he said, "SA in Star Wars feels unnecessary. You can portray power dynamics and make the audience hate the Empire in other ways without taking it to such a disgusting place. Vader wouldn't tolerate that shit, nor does the Empire condone it. It has no place in Star Wars, period. Unnecessary." There's a few things that are kind of ridiculous right on its face. I mean, his first thing that he says is Vader wouldn't tolerate that shit, nor does the Empire condone it. And it just goes to show his kind of ignorance of how these systems would actually work. Why would Vader give a crap what some guy on some backwater planet on a power trip is going to do? And certainly the Empire probably has laws on the books about sexual assault, and we presumed this because the Empire is very clearly a reflection of, an evolution into fascism from American neoliberalism that we see in the Republic. And we also get the presumption, it's never explicitly stated, but the Empire seems to reflect a patriarchal society in some ways. And one would assume that they probably have laws on the books protecting people from sexual assault and mainly because they are framing as protecting women. We never overtly see this sort of patriarchal systemic stuff overtly in Star Wars, but we do see how it reflects America. And we also see how someone like Anakin Skywalker had this sort of incel-y sort of thing going on about his frustrated masculinity and wanting to protect Padme that eventually turned him to fascism in Revenge of the Sith. So there is elements of this sort of frustrated masculinity and this like need to protect women that is ingrained in the culture of Star Wars that certainly would be played out in a fascist environment, which often fuels itself on frustrated masculinity and control of men's sex in order to sort of frame like women needing to be protected within its culture in order to justify sort of a lot of its subjugation of other minorities. Like we see in real life fascism, how white women are argued to be like, we need to protect the white women from black people, from trans women, from da-da-da-da-da-da, and that's used to justify further restricting of rights under the auspices of protecting the white woman. Certainly Star Wars, we don't necessarily see that directly. We see similar dynamics, again, mainly with Anakin Skywalker, Revenge of the Sith. So while it would have these laws presumably on the books, no one would actually care if an Imperial officer is abusing his power because no one humanizes illegal migrants. They don't care about Bix. They don't care about these people who have been dehumanized within the Empire. So they don't give a shit. They wouldn't even really necessarily give a shit if it was an Imperial officer doing to someone of high rank, as long as it didn't cause a stir and they didn't need to, put him out on the fire to sort of be made an example of, to say, look, we really do protect women. But in this specific case, no one would care because she's an illegal immigrant. And ultimately what someone like Star Wars Theory is trying to argue Star Wars and the depiction of fascism within Star Wars into this cartoonish version of fascism, where fascism is just over-the-top Nazis doing over-the-top Nazi stuff. And certainly a lot of Star Wars, especially the movies, especially even the sequel trilogy to a degree, even though he probably wouldn't like those movies, ultimately does feed into this cartoonish depiction of fascism, which is much more of a pastiche of fascism rather than, and more of a sort of otherizing version of fascism, rather than necessarily look at what Star Wars from its inception was trying to do, which is trying to show how fascism that the Empire reflects is not only in sort of its clear evocation of the Nazis, but also in American imperialism, such as with George Lucas saying that the Empire was meant to represent America in Vietnam, for example. And Star Wars, to a degree, is powerful because it connects both Nazi fascism to American imperialism and how those two things are connected. And Star Wars Andor in specific is a show that is pulling from so much disparate history in its show that it is directly trying to draw out those historical parallels. We have Star Wars Andor not only pulling from stuff with migrants, as we see in this episode, but they are clearly pulling from the history of leftist revolutionary movements. They are pulling from American imperialism that we see in like the first episode of the first season of Star Wars, where the Republic, which was sort of representing American neoliberalism at the time, was the group that colonized Cassian Andor's home planet. It wasn't the Empire who did that. It was the Republic that that eventually turned into the Empire. So we are seeing all of these connections and historical parallels that Star Wars Andor is making to try to showcase how all of these things are systemic within neoliberal and sort of imperialist and colonialist, and sort of drawing all those parallels in a way that is even more evoking like the actual history than the more sort of pop cultural version of fascism that George Lucas was dealing with in his original movie. And as a result, Star Wars Andor is a much more adult version of Star Wars. It is a Star Wars that is trying to look at and take all of these things very seriously and trying to connect all of these things. So as we watch the show, we can sort of remove ourselves directly from like looking at all of these elements as like, oh, this is a 1-for-1 with America, but showing how all of these things intermingle and how they all sort of feed into these same systems and build up in sort of into something like the imperial fascism. And so when Star Wars Theory is saying stuff like Vader wouldn't tolerate the shit, it's him having this, wanting to maintain this cartoonish version of Star Wars that is ultimately childish. It is a childish understanding of fascism. But that brings me to my next point, because there is an argument to be made that Star Wars is a franchise for children. And while I would argue someone like Star Wars Theory is an adult man who wishes to not look at these things because he wishes to remain a child, there's something worth arguing about, like, is this something worth discussing in a series for children? I would argue that as Star Wars has franchised out and gotten bigger and bigger and bigger, what is it trying to do with these different shows, like Star Wars Andor, or The Acolyte, or whatever have you, is make shows for different audiences. There's a kid Star Wars show, there's an adult Star Wars show. And Star Wars Andor is meant to be the adult Star Wars show, and it wants to look at these things more directly. So I understand the argument that Star Wars as a franchise maybe shouldn't necessarily like, I wouldn't want this in like the kids Star Wars show. But I think it misunderstands how the Star Wars as a and like, we can argue about whether or not Star Wars as a franchise is a good idea. I certainly have made my own thoughts known on that elsewhere. But if we're going to take it as these disparate buckets for media, Star Wars Andor, if it's going to take this thing seriously, which is the terms the show is setting for us, then yes, this is something that is realistic to what it is trying to depict. And I think it is part of its mission statement to showcase these things. So I think that there's a kernel of an interesting argument there. And again, I have feelings about that and how Disney has done that and things like that, but it is ultimately misunderstanding what Star Wars is doing. And again, these people like Star Wars Theory are sort of bad faith trying to pull Star Wars into just centering their worldview, where they get to have a more childish understanding of these things. They don't have to look at these things that would affect migrants, would affect women, would affect many other people who face these issues of sexual assault. Because it's certainly not just cisgender women, not just migrants, but trans women, trans men, non-binary people generally, people of color generally. Like, I make a whole fucking list, which is dark, and I maybe should not do that. But you know what I'm ultimately trying to say. And it's also worth noting that Star Wars, even in the more quote-unquote cartoonish version of stuff, has indirectly implied these things happening. I think the most obvious version is Leia in Return of the Jedi being made into, in the terms of the show, a slave under Jabba the Hutt. It is very much implied that if she wasn't sexually assaulted, she was going to be at some point, given her very sexualized outfit that we as a culture have sort of made into like an empowering, like, look how sexy slave Leia costume is, which I have feelings about. It is something that is implied to exist within the Star Wars franchise. But again, in a media show made for children, it doesn't directly address that. And as a result, going into that whole way of like slave Leia has been sexualized within our own culture allows us to ignore the implications of these things and have it become sort of cartoonish fun, like, ooh, look how sexy Leia is, without addressing these things. And again, there's an element of, in a show made for kids, maybe you can let that go, but there is things that make me uncomfortable. Even looking back as a kid, I always thought, oh yeah, slave Leia is sexy. But looking back on it, there's an element of this culture that is, by letting this thing remain kind of cartoonish, it lets us not necessarily look at these things directly. And I think it results in people like we see with Star Wars theory not being willing to want to look at these things directly, because it doesn't affect them and they don't need to think about it. They don't want to think about it. And that's ultimately what frustrates me with this argument, is that what he is arguing, first and foremost, is that he doesn't want to think about it. He doesn't want to think about it in his Star Wars show. And again, I get it. Some people, you don't necessarily go to a Star Wars show for those things if you're looking for that. But then I would just say, if that's not something you're looking for in a Star Wars show, then don't watch Star Wars Andor, because that's what Star Wars Andor is ultimately going to be doing. It's a show that's dealing with genocides. Literally, it's directly, Star Wars has always talked about genocides. We had literally the genocide of the Jedi being one of the main, first things we learn about the Star Wars universe. But it is a show that's taking that very seriously and looking directly at that. So if you're willing to look at that stuff, but not sexual assault, then what does it kind of say about you? It's sort of allowing you to remain in this cartoonish world that you're willing to whatever, yada, yada, ooh, let's have fun in a world where genocides happen. And again, I'm not necessarily even judging that for what Star Wars was trying to do, but not willing to look at, if you're going to take Star Wars Andor and what it's trying to do on its face, not willing to look at the other ramifications of that. And that's ultimately what frustrates me with his argument. However, for me, I actually think there's other things to discuss here when it comes to the depiction of sexual assault within shows like this. Because there's an element of me, as someone who has been the victim of sexual assault, I've talked about it elsewhere, I'm not going to go into detail on it, it is hard for me to watch scenes like this. And it is somewhat of a trope that the lead women character in a show or movie will face something like this. This type of storyline where a guy comes in and tries to use his power to sort of coerce a woman into sex and eventually try to directly is not new to me in fiction. And it's sometimes hard for me to look at a show being are we going to do this again to the main character? Especially Bix, who's a character in the show who's already dealt with a lot of trauma and pain. She was literally tortured in season 1. So it's we're going to keep compounding this woman's trauma as a character beat point to sort of get at the larger systemic issues that we want to discuss. And there's an element of it that comes across as a little bit cruel from the writers towards the character. And I also have conflicting feelings on the depiction of just sexual assault generally within shows. I think sometimes there is more power if it's one of those things where it's I don't think that you should never address these things. I think we should. And in a show like Star Wars Andor, I think it is something that you should be looking at, because it's a show that is talking about how all these things exist within a fascist environment. And I think it is important to discuss elements of that. However, there's part of me that sometimes feels that there is a voyeuristic element of watching it happen. And there's sometimes even more power in implying and not necessarily depicting. And sometimes I think shows and movies sometimes get too enamored with ooh, we're going to show every single moment of this. And it can have an effect of for example, an overt example of this is I think 13 Reasons Why was a TV series where it overtly depicted someone trying to die by suicide. And depictions of someone trying to die by suicide can be very harmful because it can show people how to die by suicide. And it's sometimes even stronger to just evoke what happened rather than actually physically depicting it. I think a very similar thing applies with sexual assault and rape for the most part. Not to say you should never depict it, not to show how harrowing it is, but sometimes I think there's a weird voyeurism, a disgusting voyeurism in trying to display this as something fascinating to watch. Not something enjoyable to watch necessarily. Voyeurism doesn't necessarily mean enjoyable in a sort of overt aspect, but a certain spectacleizing of something like this. What I will ultimately say, though, is that I do feel that, while I have complicated feelings, I'm not going to say negative, I have complicated feelings around it appearing in the show. I feel like this is something that Star Wars Andor should, so it's certainly underneath its auspices to address, I think is the best way to put it. And also the way that they did it, if they were going to do it, is I think the best way to do it. Because at the end of the day, Bix does not get assaulted. She does kill the guy, and she is able to rescue herself. So there's a sense of like she is able to have some agency in fighting back against these things. Because too often the worst trope is that the guy comes in to save the girl. And it's sort of the guy's like, oh, I'm going to protect the woman. Going back to sort of these narratives around protecting women that we have within our society, and never giving really women agency in handling that. It's like she always needs protected by a guy. And certainly in this episode of Andor, there was setup for that. Cassian Andor, the lead character, I won't give all the specifics in case you haven't seen the episode, was on his way back. And certainly the show could have easily set it up that he came in right at the right moment to save Bix. But the show didn't do that. It allowed her to kill the guy and then kill another Imperial guy right afterwards and directly name what happened. She was the character who used the word. She names what the guy was trying to do to her. And I think there's a power in that naming, her getting to name it and her getting to fight back and beat the guy up. And so while I do have complicated feelings around her being a character that's having this compounding trauma over and over again, I think ultimately if you're going to do it, this is the best way to do it. And certainly I also think that it is worthwhile discussing as a thing that happens within fascism that this show is trying to overtly depict in a very realistic way. And while we can have larger discussions about the franchise being for children or whatever, but if we're going to take Star Wars Andor on the terms that it is setting, I think that this is, well within its auspices and handled it very, very well for what it is doing. But looking at Star Wars as a franchise, there's a larger discussion there. But looking at people like Star Wars Theory, and the arrogance being there, I have less empathy for that, because while I think there's an earnest discussion around what Star Wars as a franchise means and, who's it for and who should it be for and whether we should be franchising out every single piece of media so it's doing a billion different things rather than the original necessary story and audience it was intended for. People like Star Wars Theory are not necessarily arguing on those terms. They're arguing so that they don't have to look at these things. They don't have to have that discussion. They're trying to shut it down so that they say, I don't have to think about it. I don't want to think about it. I don't want to have these discussions. And it's a certain level of privilege that they get to try to make that choice, that they get to try and say, oh, I don't want to deal with it, because it's a lived reality for many people. And some people don't get the privilege of looking away from it. And certainly whilst many people would want to escape watching it, and I certainly understand that. I certainly didn't love watching it. But I think, you have to understand the thing that you're going into. And Star Wars Andor made very clear that this is what the type of show it was. So those are overall my complicated feelings on this, because I did want to at least discuss it, because I think there's actually a lot more to untangle here than Star Wars Theory bad and silly because he didn't think Vader would care, because he thought Vader would care about something like this. Because I think there's more nuance to the discussion that I think, I don't think there's any one specific right answer, but I think something worth having a larger conversation about. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. What did you think about the scene in Star Wars Andor, or overall the depiction of this within Star Wars? My heart to everybody who has dealt with stuff like this. I certainly am there with you, but I ultimately think it's something that we should be talking about. So anyways, I hope you all, my friends, live long and prosper.